The abandonment Margaret Thompson sat quietly in the passenger seat of the expensive black sedan, her weathered hands folded neatly in her lap. At 78 years old, she had seen many changes in her life, but nothing had prepared her for the coldness that had crept into her relationship with her son, Robert. The leather seats felt foreign beneath her, a stark reminder of the wealth that had driven a wedge between them over the years. Robert gripped the steering wheel with manicured hands, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the early morning hour. He had built his fortune in real estate, climbing from modest beginnings to become one of the city's most successful developers. But success had changed him in ways that Margaret barely recognized anymore. The kind boy who once brought her wildflowers had transformed into a calculating man who saw everything, including family relationships, through the lens of profit and loss. "Where are we going, Robert?" Margaret asked softly, noticing they had been driving for over an hour through increasingly rural countryside. The familiar streets of the city had long disappeared, replaced by dense forests and winding mountain roads. Her son had been unusually quiet during the drive, speaking only in short, clipped responses when she tried to make conversation. "Just a little trip." "Mother," Robert replied without looking at her, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "You said you wanted to see the countryside again." Margaret frowned slightly. She couldn't recall expressing such a desire, but her memory hadn't been as sharp lately. The early stages of dementia had begun to cloud certain moments, though she remained lucid most of the time. Robert had been using these lapses against her, questioning her ability to live independently and manage her own affairs. The truth was far more sinister than a simple countryside drive. Robert had been struggling financially despite his outward appearance of success. Several of his recent developments had failed, leaving him with crushing debt and angry investors. His mother's modest but valuable property, left to her by Margaret's late husband, represented his only way out of financial ruin. But Margaret had refused to sell, wanting to leave something for her grandchildren whom Robert rarely allowed her to see. The car turned onto a narrow dirt road that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. Tall pine trees created a canopy overhead, filtering the morning sunlight into scattered patches on the forest floor. Margaret felt a growing sense of unease as they traveled further from civilization. She had lived in the city all her life and felt uncomfortable in such isolated surroundings. "Robert, I think we should turn back," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This doesn't look safe." "We're almost there," he replied curtly, his jaw set in determination. He had spent weeks planning this moment, researching remote locations where his mother might never be found. The guilt he felt was overshadowed by desperation and greed. After another 20 minutes of rough driving, Robert pulled the car to a stop in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. The silence was immediately noticeable after hours of engine noise. No sounds of traffic, no voices of other people, just the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. Margaret looked around nervously, seeing nothing but trees stretching in every direction. "Why are we stopping here?" she asked, genuine fear now creeping into her voice. Robert turned off the engine and sat in silence for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and detached. "Mother, I need you to get out of the car." "What?" "Robert, what's going on? This isn't funny anymore." "I said get out of the car." His tone left no room for argument. With shaking hands, Margaret opened the passenger door and stepped onto the uneven ground. Her legs felt weak beneath her. Whether from fear or the early stages of the illness that was slowly claiming her mind, she couldn't tell. She wore only a light cardigan over her dress, inappropriate clothing for the cool mountain air. Robert remained in the driver's seat, not bothering to help his elderly mother as she struggled to maintain her balance on the rough terrain. "I can't take care of you anymore, Mother. This is better for everyone." The reality of the situation hit Margaret like a physical blow. Her own son, the child she had raised and loved unconditionally, was abandoning her in the wilderness. "Robert, please don't do this. I'm your mother. I raised you, I loved you, I gave you everything I could." "You gave me nothing but problems," he snapped, finally showing emotion. "Your medical bills, your stubbornness about the house, your constant needs. I have my own family to think about now, my own future." Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized the depth of her son's betrayal. "What about your children? What will you tell them about their grandmother?" "I'll tell them you went to live in a care facility far away. They'll forget about you soon enough." Robert's words cut through her heart like knives. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out Margaret's small purse, tossing it onto the ground beside her feet. "There's some money in there. Maybe you can find your way to a road or something." As Robert prepared to drive away, Margaret made one final desperate plea. "Son, please. I forgive you for whatever anger you're carrying. Just take me home. We can work this out." But Robert had already made his choice. He put the car in reverse without another word, leaving tire tracks in the soft earth as he maneuvered around and headed back down the dirt road. Margaret stood frozen in the clearing, watching the black sedan disappear through the trees until even the sound of its engine faded into silence. The forest around her seemed to close in as the reality of her situation became clear. She was alone, miles from any civilization, with limited supplies and no way to communicate with the outside world. Her cell phone had no signal in this remote location, and the few dollars in her purse would be useless here. Margaret sank down onto a fallen log, her body trembling from both cold and shock. The canopy of trees blocked most of the sunlight, creating an almost twilight atmosphere even though it was still morning. She could hear the sound of running water somewhere in the distance, suggesting a stream or creek nearby, but she wasn't sure she had the strength to search for it. As the hours passed, Margaret's situation grew more desperate. The temperature began to drop as clouds moved in overhead, and she realized that Robert had not only abandoned her, but had chosen a time when the weather forecast called for rain. Her light clothing provided little protection against the elements, and she had no shelter to protect her from what was coming. The first drops of rain began to fall just as darkness started to creep through the forest, and Margaret knew she was facing a night that might be her last. The first night. The rain began as a light drizzle but quickly intensified into a steady downpour that soaked through Margaret's thin cardigan within minutes. She pulled her arms tightly around herself, trying to conserve what little body heat she had left as the cold mountain water ran down her face and neck. The clearing that had seemed peaceful in the daylight now felt menacing and endless under the dark, overcast sky. Margaret struggled to her feet from the fallen log, her joints stiff and protesting after hours of sitting in the damp air. She knew she needed to find some form of shelter or she wouldn't survive the night. The forest around her was a maze of shadows and unfamiliar shapes, but she had no choice but to venture into it if she hoped to live until morning. Moving slowly and carefully, she made her way toward the sound of running water she had heard earlier. Each step was treacherous on the wet, uneven ground covered with fallen leaves and hidden roots. Several times she stumbled, catching herself against tree trunks that were now slick with rain. Her dress clung to her legs, making movement even more difficult. After what felt like an eternity of careful navigation through the darkness, Margaret found a small creek winding through the forest. The water was clear and cold, offering at least one solution to her immediate needs. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, the fresh water providing some relief to her parched throat. But the sound of the flowing creek also masked other sounds in the forest, making her feel even more vulnerable and alone. Following the creek bank, Margaret searched for any natural shelter she could find. Her eyes had adjusted somewhat to the darkness, allowing her to make out the shapes of large boulders and fallen trees. Finally, she discovered a massive pine tree that had toppled over years ago, creating a natural lean-to shelter against a rocky outcropping. The space underneath was cramped and far from comfortable, but it offered protection from the worst of the rain. Margaret crawled into the makeshift shelter, her knees scraping against the rough ground. The space smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves, but it was dry compared to the open forest. She pulled her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them, trying to make herself as small as possible to conserve heat. The sound of rain drumming on the fallen tree trunk above her head was almost deafening. As the night wore on, Margaret's condition deteriorated. Her wet clothes had lowered her body temperature dangerously, and she began to shiver uncontrollably. The early stages of hypothermia were setting in, making her feel drowsy despite the urgent need to stay alert. Her mind began to wander, memories of her life flashing through her consciousness in disconnected fragments. She remembered Robert as a young boy, no more than 6 years old, running to her with scraped knees and tears in his eyes. She had kissed his wounds and told him everything would be all right, never imagining that one day he would be the source of her greatest pain. The irony was not lost on her that she now needed someone to comfort her in the same way. but there was no one left who cared enough to try. Around midnight, the rain finally began to ease, but the damage was already done. Margaret's clothing was soaked through, and her body had lost too much heat to recover easily. She felt her consciousness beginning to slip away despite her efforts to stay awake. The sounds of the forest seemed to fade into the background as exhaustion and cold overcame her survival instincts. In her semi-conscious state, Margaret began to hear things that might not have been real. Footsteps in the leaves, voices calling her name, the sound of car engines in the distance. She called out weakly several times, hoping against hope that Robert had changed his mind and come back for her, but there was never any response. The forest remained as empty and indifferent as it had been when he first drove away. As dawn approached, Margaret's breathing had become shallow and irregular. Her lips had taken on a blue tinge and her fingers and toes had gone numb from the cold. She was experiencing the advanced stages of hypothermia, and without immediate medical intervention, she would not survive another night in the wilderness. Her body's systems were beginning to shut down, preparing for what seemed like an inevitable end. But Margaret was not quite ready to give up. Some deep survival instinct kept her from slipping into unconsciousness completely. She forced herself to move her arms and legs periodically, generating small amounts of heat through muscle activity. She also began to focus on memories that brought her warmth and comfort, particularly thoughts of her grandchildren whom she rarely got to see but loved deeply. The first light of dawn filtered through the forest canopy, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Margaret could see her breath in the cold morning air, a visible reminder of how close she had come to death during the night. Her body was weak and her movement sluggish, but she was still alive, still fighting against the odds that her son had stacked against her. From her shelter under the fallen tree, Margaret could see that the storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening with morning dew. Birds had begun to sing in the distance, their cheerful songs a stark contrast to her desperate situation. She knew she needed to find help soon, or the next nightfall would likely be her last. With tremendous effort, Margaret crawled out from under her makeshift shelter and attempted to stand. Her legs buckled initially, forcing her to grab onto a nearby tree for support. The simple act of standing upright left her dizzy and breathless, but she was determined to try to walk while she still had some strength left. She began to follow the creek downstream, reasoning that water sources often led to human settlements eventually. Each step was a monumental effort, and she had to stop frequently to rest against trees and rocks. Her progress was painfully slow, but she continued moving, driven by a stubborn refusal to die alone in the wilderness at the hands of her own son's cruelty. Margaret's journey along the creek bank became a test of pure willpower over physical limitation. Her body wanted to collapse and give up, but her mind held on to the slim hope that somewhere ahead lay salvation. She had no way of knowing that help was indeed coming, or that her rescue would arrive in a form she never could have expected. The guardian angel 3 miles away from where Margaret struggled along the creek bank, a large German shepherd named Rex was exploring the same forest system with his owner, Marine Sergeant Jake Morrison. Rex was not an ordinary pet, but a retired military working dog who had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan alongside Jake. The bond between them had been forged in combat zones where they had depended on each other for survival, and that partnership had continued seamlessly into civilian life. Jake had brought Rex to the mountains for their weekly hiking expedition, a routine that helped both of them cope with the transition from military to civilian life. The physical activity and time in nature provided therapy for Jake's mild post-traumatic stress symptoms, while Rex enjoyed the freedom to explore and use his highly trained senses in a peaceful environment, rather than searching for explosives and enemy combatants. Rex was a magnificent animal, standing nearly 30 inches at the shoulder with the classic black and tan coloring of his breed. His military training had honed his natural intelligence and protective instincts to an exceptional level. He could detect scents from incredible distances, navigate complex terrain with ease, and assess threats with the precision of a seasoned soldier. More importantly, he had an unwavering loyalty to protecting innocent people, a trait that had made him legendary among the troops he had served with overseas. On this particular morning, Rex had been unusually restless during their hike. His ears were constantly perked forward, and he frequently stopped to sniff the air with an intensity that Jake recognized from their military days. Something was capturing the dog's attention, but Jake couldn't determine what it might be. The forest seemed peaceful and normal to human senses, filled with the typical sounds of wildlife and rustling vegetation. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, kneeling down to scratch behind Rex's ears. The dog looked up at him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent. Rex had never been wrong when his instincts told him something was amiss, and Jake had learned to trust the animal's superior senses implicitly. Rex suddenly broke away from Jake's side and began moving through the forest with purposeful determination. His nose was to the ground, following a scent trail that was invisible to his human companion. Jake followed, trusting that Rex had detected something worth investigating. They moved quickly through the dense vegetation, with Rex leading the way along paths that seemed to exist only in the dog's memory. After nearly an hour of tracking, Rex's behavior became even more urgent. He began to whine softly, a sound Jake had heard before when the dog was trying to alert him to the presence of wounded soldiers. The German shepherd's pace increased, and he frequently looked back to make sure Jake was keeping up. Whatever Rex had found, it was something that required immediate attention. The scent trail led them to the creek where Margaret had spent her second night in the wilderness. By this time, she had made little progress from her original shelter. Managing to travel less than half a mile in her weakened condition, she had collapsed beside the water, unable to continue walking but still conscious enough to drink from the stream when her body demanded it. Rex found Margaret lying on her side near the creek bank, barely moving and clearly in severe distress. Her lips were blue from hypothermia, her breathing was shallow, and her eyes were only partially open. She was still alive, but just barely. The dog immediately began barking in the specific pattern he had been trained to use when locating casualties in combat zones. Jake heard Rex's alert barking and rushed toward the sound, crashing through undergrowth and jumping over fallen logs. When he reached the creek and saw Margaret's condition, his military medical training immediately kicked in. He had treated hypothermia and exposure cases before, and he recognized that she was in critical condition but still savable if he acted quickly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Jake called out as he knelt beside Margaret and began checking her vital signs. Her pulse was weak and irregular, and her skin was cold and clammy to the touch. She stirred slightly at the sound of his voice but seemed unable to focus on his face or respond coherently. Rex positioned himself protectively beside Margaret, using his large body to provide additional warmth while Jake assessed the situation. The dog seemed to understand instinctively that this was a rescue mission, and he remained calm and alert while his owner worked. His presence also seemed to have a calming effect on Margaret, who appeared less agitated when she could feel the warm fur against her side. Jake quickly removed his own jacket and wrapped it around Margaret's shoulders, then used his cell phone to check for signal. They were still too deep in the wilderness for reliable communication, but he knew that getting Margaret to warmth and medical care was more important than calling for backup immediately. He would have to carry her out of the forest himself. "We're going to get you out of here," Jake told Margaret in the calm, reassuring tone he had used with wounded soldiers. "My name is Jake, and this is Rex. We're going to take care of you." Margaret's eyes focused on Jake's face for the first time, and she managed to whisper a single word: "Help." Jake carefully lifted Margaret into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. Her condition had clearly deteriorated over the 2 days she had been missing, and he estimated that she had lost a dangerous amount of weight through dehydration and exposure. Rex took point position, leading them back toward the trail that would take them to Jake's truck parked at the forest access road. The journey back to civilization became a race against time. Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness as Jake carried her, and her breathing became increasingly labored. Rex stayed close to them throughout the trek, occasionally running ahead to scout the path but always returning to check on their progress. The dog's military training had taught him the importance of protecting casualties during transport, and he took this responsibility seriously. After what felt like hours but was actually about 90 minutes, they reached Jake's truck. He carefully placed Margaret in the passenger seat and cranked up the heater to begin warming her core temperature. Rex jumped into the back seat, positioning himself where he could keep watch over Margaret during the drive to the nearest hospital. As they raced down the mountain roads toward medical help, Margaret's condition began to stabilize slightly in the warm environment of the truck. Her breathing became more regular and some color returned to her face. She was still critically ill, but Jake's quick action and Rex's incredible tracking ability had given her a fighting chance at survival. The road to recovery. The emergency room at Mountain View Hospital erupted into controlled chaos as Jake carried Margaret through the automatic doors, with Rex following closely behind despite hospital policies about animals. The medical staff immediately recognized the severity of Margaret's condition and rushed her into a trauma bay, where a team of doctors and nurses began working to stabilize her vital signs. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending emergency physician, took one look at Margaret's blue-tinged skin and shallow breathing before ordering immediate interventions for severe hypothermia. "Get me warm blankets, heated IV fluids, and prepare for cardiac monitoring," she called out to her team. This patient has been exposed to the elements for an extended period. Jake provided what little information he could about finding Margaret in the forest, but he had no details about her identity or how she had ended up alone in the wilderness. Her purse had contained some cash and a few personal items, but no identification documents. The mystery of who she was and how she had gotten into such a desperate situation would have to wait until she was stable enough to provide answers herself. The medical team worked efficiently to raise Margaret's core body temperature using a combination of external warming devices and heated intravenous fluids. Her heart rate and blood pressure were carefully monitored as her body began to respond to the treatment. The process was delicate because warming someone too quickly after severe hypothermia could cause dangerous cardiac arrhythmias. Rex had been reluctantly moved to the hospital lobby, where he waited patiently beside Jake's chair. The dog seemed to understand that his part of the rescue mission was complete, but he remained alert and ready to respond if needed. Hospital security initially tried to remove the animal, but Jake's explanation of Rex's role in saving Margaret's life, combined with his military credentials, convinced them to make an exception to their no pets policy. After several hours of intensive treatment, Margaret's condition began to stabilize. Her body temperature had returned to near normal levels and her breathing had become more regular and deeper. The IV fluids had helped correct her dehydration, and her blood pressure had improved significantly. Dr. Chen was cautiously optimistic about her recovery, though she warned Jake that Margaret would need several days of hospitalization to fully recover from her ordeal. As Margaret slowly regained consciousness in the hospital bed, her first coherent words were questions about her location and how she had gotten there. Jake, who had remained at the hospital throughout her treatment, gently explained how Rex had found her in the forest and how they had brought her to safety. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she realized that strangers had risked their own safety to save her life. "I don't understand why you helped me," Margaret whispered, her voice still weak from her ordeal. "You don't even know me." Jake smiled and squeezed her hand gently. "That's what people do for each other, ma'am. Rex and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." Over the next few days, as Margaret's physical condition improved, she began to share the devastating story of how she had ended up alone in the forest. Jake listened with growing anger and disbelief as she described Robert's calculated abandonment of his elderly mother. The betrayal was so complete and heartless that Jake struggled to understand how any person could commit such an act against their own family. Margaret also learned more about her rescuers during her recovery. Jake shared stories about his military service and how Rex had been his constant companion through dangerous missions overseas. The bond between them was something Margaret could appreciate, having experienced unconditional loyalty in her marriage before her husband's death. She began to understand that Rex's ability to find her had been no accident but the result of years of training and an innate drive to protect innocent people. The hospital staff were amazed by Margaret's resilience and positive attitude despite what she had endured. Instead of becoming bitter or withdrawn, she seemed to find strength in the kindness that Jake and Rex had shown her. She spoke frequently about her gratitude and her determination to rebuild her life with the second chance they had given her. Dr. Chen explained to Margaret that she had come very close to death from hypothermia and exposure. Another few hours in the forest would likely have been fatal, making her rescue by Jake and Rex nothing short of miraculous. The doctor also recommended counseling to help Margaret process the trauma of her son's abandonment, recognizing that emotional wounds often take longer to heal than physical ones. As Margaret's strength returned, she began to make plans for her future. She contacted a lawyer to discuss pressing charges against Robert for elderly abuse and abandonment. She also started the process of finding a new place to live, knowing that she could never feel safe in the same city as the son who had tried to kill her. The legal proceedings would be complicated, but Margaret was determined to see justice done. Jake visited Margaret every day during her hospital stay, often bringing Rex with him when the staff would allow it. The dog seemed to have appointed himself as Margaret's personal guardian, always positioning himself where he could watch both her and the door to her room. The bond that had formed between the three of them during the rescue had continued to grow stronger as they got to know each other better. On Margaret's final day in the hospital, Jake made an unexpected offer. He had been living alone since leaving the military, and his house had more space than he needed. He suggested that Margaret consider staying with him and Rex while she got back on her feet, at least until she could find permanent housing and resolve her legal situation with Robert. Margaret was touched by Jake's generosity, but worried about being a burden to someone who had already done so much for her. Jake assured her that having her around would actually be beneficial for both him and Rex, providing them with the sense of purpose and family connection that had been missing from their civilian lives. The arrangement made practical sense as well as emotional sense. Margaret's medical bills would be substantial, and her fixed income would make it difficult to afford both housing and legal fees while pursuing the case against Robert. Jake's offer provided her with stability and security during a time when she needed both desperately. As they prepared to leave the hospital together, Margaret reflected on how completely her life had changed in just 1 week. She had gone from being abandoned and left for dead to finding a new family in the most unexpected place. The cruelty of her son's betrayal would always remain with her, but it had been overshadowed by the compassion and bravery of two strangers who had chosen to save her life when her own flesh and blood had chosen to end it. Justice and new beginnings. 3 months after her rescue, Margaret had transformed from a frail, abandoned elderly woman into a determined survivor with a renewed sense of purpose. Living with Jake and Rex had provided her with the stability and emotional support she needed to pursue justice against Robert while rebuilding her physical and mental health. The modest ranch house had become a true home for all three of them, filled with warmth and mutual respect that none of them had experienced in years. The legal case against Robert had gained significant media attention once the full story became public. Detective Maria Rodriguez, who had been assigned to investigate the case, was shocked by the calculated nature of Robert's crime. "In 20 years of police work, I've seen a lot of family disputes, but I've never encountered anything this cold-blooded," she told reporters. This wasn't a moment of anger or poor judgment. This was premeditated abandonment of a vulnerable elderly person. Robert's initial response to the charges was to deny everything, claiming that his mother had become confused due to her early-stage dementia and had wandered off during what he described as a pleasant country drive. His expensive legal team tried to paint Margaret as an unreliable witness whose memory problems made her testimony questionable. However, their strategy quickly fell apart when investigators discovered Robert's online searches for remote forest locations in the weeks before Margaret's abandonment. The evidence against Robert became overwhelming as the investigation progressed. Cell phone tower data showed that he had visited the same remote area twice in the month before abandoning Margaret, apparently scouting the location to ensure it was isolated enough for his purposes. Financial records revealed his desperate situation, including multiple missed payments and threatening letters from creditors. His motive for wanting Margaret's property became crystal clear to prosecutors. Margaret's testimony during the preliminary hearings was both heartbreaking and compelling. Despite her age and health challenges, she spoke clearly and confidently about the events leading up to her abandonment. Her memory of that day was sharp and detailed, contradicting Robert's claims about her mental competency. The judge noted that Margaret showed no signs of confusion or unreliability during her testimony. Jake had become Margaret's strongest advocate throughout the legal proceedings, attending every hearing and providing emotional support when the stress became overwhelming. His military bearing and credible witness testimony about Margaret's condition when he found her added weight to the prosecution's case. Rex, meanwhile, had become something of a celebrity, with news outlets calling him a hero dog and featuring his story prominently in their coverage. The publicity surrounding the case brought unexpected benefits for Margaret beyond just legal vindication. Donations began pouring in from strangers who had been moved by her story, providing her with financial resources she had never expected to have. More importantly, the story reconnected her with distant relatives and old friends who had lost touch over the years, rebuilding social connections that Robert had systematically undermined. Robert's wife, Linda, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest, taking their children and moving to another state. In court documents, she stated that she had been unaware of Robert's financial problems and was horrified by his treatment of Margaret. She also revealed that Robert had prevented the children from visiting their grandmother for months before the abandonment, claiming that Margaret's health issues made visits too stressful for the family. The impact on Robert's children was one of the most tragic aspects of the entire situation. Margaret's grandchildren, ages 12 and 14, had genuinely loved their grandmother and been devastated when they were told she had moved away. Learning the truth about their father's actions shattered their trust and left them struggling with complex emotions about family loyalty and moral responsibility. As the trial date approached, Robert's legal team made several attempts to negotiate a plea bargain, recognizing that their client's position was becoming increasingly untenable. The prosecution, led by District Attorney James Mitchell, was initially reluctant to consider any deal that didn't include significant prison time. The defendant didn't just abandon his mother, Mitchell stated. He sentenced her to death in one of the most callous ways imaginable. Margaret surprised everyone by expressing some willingness to consider a plea agreement if it included genuine accountability from Robert and guaranteed restitution for her medical expenses and trauma. She explained that while she wanted justice, she also didn't want to put her grandchildren through the additional trauma of a lengthy, highly publicized trial. Her compassion toward the family that had betrayed her impressed even the hardened prosecutors working on her case. The breakthrough in plea negotiations came when Robert's financial situation became so desperate that his legal team could no longer maintain their aggressive defense strategy. Faced with mounting legal bills and the prospect of losing at trial, Robert finally agreed to plead guilty to elderly abuse, abandonment, and reckless endangerment charges. The plea agreement included a sentence of 3 to 5 years in prison, substantial financial restitution to Margaret, and mandatory counseling. During the sentencing hearing, Margaret chose to address the court directly, speaking to her son for the first time since his arrest. Her words were measured and dignified, expressing both her pain at his betrayal and her hope that he would eventually understand the magnitude of his actions. "You were my child and I loved you unconditionally," she said. "I hope someday you can find the person you used to be before greed and selfishness took over your heart." Robert's response was minimal and clearly scripted by his attorneys, offering what sounded like a rehearsed apology, without any genuine emotion or acknowledgement of the specific harm he had caused. Margaret later told Jake that she hadn't expected anything different, but she had needed to speak her truth regardless of how Robert received it. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Williams, handed down a sentence at the maximum end of the plea agreement, citing the particularly vulnerable nature of the victim and the calculated cruelty of the crime. "Mr. Thompson, you violated the most basic obligation that children have to their parents," Judge Williams stated. "Your actions were not just criminal but morally reprehensible. You showed no mercy to the woman who gave you life, and this court will show no mercy to you." With the legal proceedings finally concluded, Margaret felt a sense of closure that allowed her to focus fully on building her new life. The financial settlement provided her with security she had never known, but more importantly, her experience had connected her with Jake and Rex, who had become the family she had always deserved. The three of them had formed an unconventional but deeply loving household, based on mutual respect, shared experiences, and genuine care for each other's well-being. A family forged by love 2 years after her rescue, Margaret Thompson's life had been completely transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The small ranch house she shared with Jake and Rex had become a beacon of hope in their community, known as much for the remarkable story of how its residents found each other as for the warmth and kindness that emanated from within its walls. Margaret had used part of her legal settlement to make improvements to Jake's property, creating a beautiful garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers. The physical activity involved in gardening had become therapeutic for her, helping to rebuild the strength she had lost during her ordeal while providing a peaceful outlet for processing her experiences. Rex had appointed himself supervisor of all gardening activities, often lying in the shade nearby while Margaret worked, always alert for any signs that she might need assistance. Jake had found new purpose in caring for Margaret, discovering that the protective instincts he had developed in the military translated perfectly to civilian life when applied to someone who truly needed his help. His own healing from combat-related trauma had accelerated significantly since Margaret joined their household, as focusing on her well-being had given him a reason to develop healthy routines and positive coping mechanisms. The three of them had developed their own unique family traditions and daily rituals. Margaret prepared breakfast every morning while Jake and Rex completed their morning run, creating a sense of routine and normalcy that benefited everyone involved. Evenings were spent sharing stories, watching old movies, or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. Rex had learned to position himself strategically where he could maintain physical contact with both his human companions, often lying across the space between Margaret's chair and Jake's couch. Margaret's relationship with her grandchildren had been slowly rebuilding through supervised visits and phone calls. Linda, Robert's ex-wife, had come to understand that Margaret was not responsible for her father's crimes and had been working to repair the damage that Robert's lies and manipulation had caused. The children, now older and better able to process complex emotions, had begun to see their grandmother as a victim rather than an abandoner, and their visits brought joy to all three residents of the ranch house. The media attention surrounding Margaret's story had led to unexpected opportunities for advocacy and public speaking. She had become a spokesperson for elderly abuse prevention, sharing her story at conferences and community meetings across the state. Her message was always the same: that elderly people deserve dignity, respect, and protection, and that family relationships should be sources of love and support rather than exploitation and harm. Jake had been inspired by Margaret's advocacy work to become involved in veteran support programs, using his experience with Rex to help other former military personnel train service dogs. Their work together had demonstrated the powerful healing potential of the human-animal bond, and several other veterans had successfully adopted retired military working dogs through their program. The ranch had become an informal training ground where veterans and dogs could learn to support each other in civilian life. Rex, now officially recognized as a therapy dog, had begun making regular visits to local nursing homes and assisted living facilities. His gentle nature and intuitive understanding of human emotions made him particularly effective at providing comfort to elderly residents who reminded him of Margaret. The staff at these facilities often remarked that Rex seemed to know exactly which residents needed extra attention on any given day. The financial security that Margaret had gained through her legal settlement had allowed her to establish a small foundation dedicated to supporting elderly abuse victims and funding search and rescue training for military working dogs. The foundation's first major project was providing emergency funds for elderly people who needed to escape dangerous family situations, ensuring that others wouldn't face the choice between staying in harmful environments or becoming homeless. Robert had been released from prison after serving 3 years of his sentence, but he had made no attempt to contact Margaret or apologize for his actions. According to reports from his probation officer, he had moved to another state and was working in a low-level job while struggling to rebuild his life. His ex-wife Linda had heard that he showed no signs of remorse or understanding about the severity of his crimes, suggesting that his character had not improved despite his time in prison. Margaret had made peace with the likelihood that she would never have a relationship with Robert again. The son she had raised and loved had been replaced by someone she no longer recognized, and she had come to understand that some betrayals are too profound to forgive or forget. However, she had also learned that biological family is not the only kind that matters, and that the family she had chosen with Jake and Rex was stronger and more meaningful than many traditional family relationships. The local community had embraced Margaret, Jake, and Rex as symbols of resilience and the power of human kindness. Their story had been featured in national magazines and television programs, but they remained humble and grounded, focused on their daily lives rather than their celebrity status. Margaret often said that the attention was worthwhile if it prevented even one elderly person from experiencing what she had endured. On the 3rd anniversary of her rescue, Margaret organized a celebration at the ranch that brought together everyone who had played a role in her recovery and new life. Dr. Chen from the hospital, Detective Rodriguez, District Attorney Mitchell, and dozens of friends and supporters gathered to mark not just Margaret's survival, but her transformation into an advocate and inspiration for others. During the celebration, Jake made an announcement that surprised even Margaret. He had been working with local authorities to establish an official search and rescue unit featuring retired military working dogs and their former handlers. The program would be based at their ranch and would be dedicated to finding missing elderly people and other vulnerable individuals. Margaret would serve as the program's community liaison, using her experience and public speaking skills to educate the public about elderly safety and abuse prevention. Rex seemed to understand the significance of the announcement, responding with enthusiastic barking that drew laughter from the assembled crowd. At 8 years old, he was nearing retirement from active search and rescue work, but he would continue to serve as a mentor for younger dogs entering the program. His legacy would live on through the animals he trained and the lives they would save. As the celebration continued into the evening, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her from the depths of abandonment and despair to a life filled with purpose, love, and hope. She had learned that families are not always determined by blood relationships, that heroism can come from unexpected sources, and that even the darkest experiences can be transformed into opportunities to help others. Standing in her garden with Jake and Rex beside her, watching friends and supporters enjoy themselves on her property, Margaret felt a contentment that had nothing to do with material possessions or social status. She had found her place in the world, not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as herself a survivor and advocate, and a beloved member of a family that had been created by choice rather than circumstance. The stars were beginning to appear in the clear mountain sky as the last guests departed, leaving Margaret, Jake, and Rex alone together once again. Rex settled into his usual position between them as they sat on the porch, his presence a constant reminder of the day he had saved Margaret's life and, in doing so, had saved all 3 of them from lives of isolation and missed opportunity. Margaret reached over to scratch Rex behind the ears, the same gesture that had comforted her during those first terrifying moments in the forest when she had thought she was going to die alone and forgotten. Now, surrounded by love and purpose, she knew that whatever time she had left would be spent making a difference in the world, proving that even the most devastating betrayals cannot destroy the human capacity for resilience, forgiveness, and hope.